Everybody, let's take 5 minutes out of our day and meditate on God's Word together. Do you want to know what your life could be like? Jesus tells us that our lives could be really good or really bad, depending on one thing. In Matthew 7, verse 24, Jesus tells us, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." It's hard to read that passage without thinking about the song, isn't it? The wise man built his house upon the rock, that old vacation Bible school favorite. But the one thing that the best life depends on is dependence. We depend on Jesus. What is your foundation of your life? On what does your life depend? That is what determines the outcome of your life. Now, in the context, when he says, "Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them," in general, it's the teaching of Jesus. But I think even more specifically, it's the Sermon on the Mount. Those who hear these words of his and those who do them. The rock the wise man built his house on is the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Build your house, your life on his teachings, on seeking God's righteousness, seeking first his kingdom, being transformed from the inside out. Your life is built and founded on being poor in spirit, mourning your sin, hungering and thirsting for God's righteousness, being meek in spirit, being pure in heart, being the salt of the earth, showing the covenant of God to the world around us. It's also seen in how we treat other people. It's so transformative, it gets to the inside and comes out of us. We don't treat people with hatred and anger. We treat them with love. We don't treat people as objects to be used or as pawns to be controlled, but we treat them with the respect and dignity God intended for them to have. And we're so transformed by the gospel of Jesus that we can actually love our enemies. And the things we do, our ego is not central anymore. Jesus is central. So we don't do things for the praise of other people. We don't pray and give and fast just for attention. We do it for God's praise. And we're so dependent on him that even when the anxieties of life come at us and we're scared and afraid of where the next meal is going to come from, or where the next paycheck is going to come from, or how will this bill be paid, we trust in Jesus because we know he and our Father in heaven love us and will care for us and take care of us. Note that the foolish man heard the sayings of Jesus. He just didn't do them. He knew what the teachings were. He just didn't commit his life to it. He didn't go to the end of obedience. Now, the consequences are what we should focus on here. Jesus does not say that whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them will have a flowery life, perfect, you'll have no problems. There'll be no negativity in your life. There'll be no consequences, or there'll be no trials you have to face. Jesus says, when the storms will still come, but when you depend on me, you will be able to withstand the storms. He promised us that if we trust him, it's not that we won't have storms in life, but we can survive the storms because of him. D.A. Carson has a good quote about the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "The Sermon on the Mount does not press men and women to despair, still less to self-salvation. Rather, it presses men and women to Jesus." So, as Jesus comes down off this mountain, this is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. What will you do with this? Will you accept his invitation to be poor in spirit, to mourn your sin, to be meek, to hunger and thirst for God's righteousness, to seek that purity that he gives? He's giving us the opportunity to follow him and to join him on his kingdom mission. And Jesus will actually show us what that mission looks like in his own life. We'll talk about that next time we Take 5. I'll see you then.